Hi, this is Lee from the Law School Toolbox. Welcome back to our Listen and Learn series. Today, we're continuing our discussion on criminal law, specifically crimes against the person. In our previous episode, we covered the basic elements of assault, battery, false imprisonment, and kidnapping, and walked through a scenario involving these crimes. Today, we'll build on that foundation by analyzing more complex scenarios that test the boundaries of these offenses. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, we recommend starting there to get familiar with the basic elements of these crimes before diving into today's examples. Let's look at another scenario that raises different issues. Sarah is shopping at a mall when her ex-boyfriend Tom approaches her. Tom grabs Sarah's arm and says they need to talk. Despite her protests, he pulls her into a nearby maintenance hallway. When Sarah tries to leave, Tom blocks the door and says, "We're not done talking." After 5 minutes, Tom gets a phone call and steps aside to answer it. Sarah immediately runs away. Later that evening, Tom shows up at Sarah's house. He knows Sarah's roommate Julie is away for the weekend. Tom convinces Sarah to let him in by claiming he just wants to apologize. Once inside, he forces Sarah in his car and drives her to a cabin 2 hours away, saying they need time alone to work things out. So let's analyze whether Tom has committed assault, battery, false imprisonment, and/or kidnapping based on this complex set of events. So starting with battery, we must determine whether Tom, 1, unlawfully applied force, 2, directly or indirectly upon Sarah, 3, that resulted in injury or offensive contact. These elements are satisfied here. First, Tom applied unlawful force directly upon Sarah when he grabbed Sarah's arm. This force resulted in a harmful or offensive contact because Sarah did not consent to being grabbed by the arm. Therefore, Tom may be found guilty of battery based on these facts. Tom may also have committed false imprisonment when he confined Sarah in the maintenance hallway. To determine whether Tom may be found guilty of false imprisonment, we must analyze whether 1, Tom unlawfully, 2, confined Sarah such as she had no reasonable means of escape, 3, against her will, and 4, with knowledge that the confinement was unlawful. So 1, Tom's actions confined Sarah. 2, the confinement was complete. 3, Tom intended to confine her. And 4, Sarah was aware of the confinement. All the elements are met. Tom physically blocked Sarah's exit. She had no reasonable means of escape. He clearly intended to keep her there, and Tom likely knows that this confinement is unlawful because Sarah has not consented to the confinement and indicates her desire to get out of the hallway. So what about kidnapping? Specifically, can Tom be found guilty of kidnapping when he forces Sarah into her car and drives her miles away? A kidnapping is 1, the intentional, and 2, unlawful confinement, and 3, movement of a person against their will. Some jurisdictions also require that the movement must be accomplished by force, threat of force, or fraud. Analyzing these elements, Tom intentionally and unlawfully confined Sarah in his car and moved her to a new location against her will. He used both fraud, lying about wanting to apologize, and force to accomplish this. His intent to move and confine her is evident from his statements about needing time alone. Therefore, Tom committed kidnapping. Note that this kidnapping encompassed an additional false imprisonment at the cabin and likely additional batteries if he used force during the journey or at the cabin. Now, these hypotheticals demonstrate how crimes against the person often occur in sequence or combination. A single criminal episode might include assault, creating fear of harm, battery, harmful contact, false imprisonment, confinement, and potentially escalate to kidnapping if the victim is moved. Each crime has distinct elements that must be proven, even though they may arise from the same series of events. So let's explore one final hypothetical that tests some of the trickier aspects of crime against the person, particularly situations where the line between different offenses gets blurry. So here's our scenario. James works at a local gym as a personal trainer. One of his clients, Maria, has been trying to lose weight. James develops what he believes is a tough love approach to motivation. During their sessions, he frequently stands very close to Maria, poking her stomach while making comments about her weight. When she tries to leave these uncomfortable situations, he steps in front of her saying, "We're not done with the workout yet." He also institutes a policy that she has to weigh herself before leaving each session, placing the scale in a private consultation room and insisting on being present for the weigh-in. During one session, Maria becomes particularly distressed and tries to leave. James grabs her water bottle and gym bag, taking them to the consultation room, saying, "You can have these back after you weigh in." When Maria follows him to get her belongings, he quickly closes the door behind her. Maria stands in the consultation room for 20 minutes, feeling unable to leave without her phone and car keys, which are in her gym bag, while James stands outside the door, continuing to insist on the weigh-in. So let's break down the potential criminal liability here. It's trickier than our previous examples because there are questions about consent, professional relationships, and what constitutes force or confinement. So the first issue, do James's actions during the training session constitute assault or battery? Remember our rules. Assault requires an act creating reasonable fear of immediate harmful contact, while battery requires actual harmful or offensive contact. So let's analyze the poking. While James might argue this is normal personal trainer behavior, the touching appears unwanted and offensive, particularly when combined with his comments. The key question here is whether Maria's initial consent to physical contact during training extends to this type of touching. Courts generally hold that consent to one type of physical contact doesn't automatically extend to other types. Therefore, the poking likely constitutes battery as it's an offensive touching beyond the scope of Maria's consent. The close standing presents a trickier assault analysis. In a normal training context, standing close to a client might be expected. However, when combined with the intimidating behavior and comments, it might create reasonable apprehension of harmful or offensive contact. This would likely depend on specific facts about James's demeanor and Maria's reaction. As noted above, whether James committed assault and battery is a close call. However, a jury could reasonably conclude that the elements of those crimes are satisfied under these circumstances. So let's move on to a second issue. Does keeping Maria in the consultation room constitute false imprisonment? False imprisonment, as we've discussed, requires unlawful confinement of a person against their will, with the defendant knowing the confinement is unlawful and the victim having no reasonable means of escape. The situation tests the boundaries of what constitutes confinement. James didn't physically restrain Maria or lock the door. He used her belongings as leverage to keep her in the room. Courts have held that confinement can occur through the withholding of property necessary for leaving. However, the question becomes whether Maria had a reasonable means of escape. She could have physically left the room at any time, but doing so would have meant abandoning her phone, car keys, and other belongings. The prosecution would argue this wasn't a real choice. In modern society, leaving without one's phone and car keys isn't a reasonable option. The defense would counter that psychological pressure to stay isn't the same as physical confinement. This might ultimately turn on how courts in the jurisdiction define reasonable means of escape. Some courts focus purely on physical barriers, while others consider psychological coercion and practical restrictions on movement. So with that, let's move on to our third issue. Could this confinement escalate to kidnapping? The kidnapping analysis here is particularly interesting because any movement was technically voluntary. Maria walked to the consultation room herself. However, courts have held that transportation through fraud or coercion can satisfy the movement element of kidnapping. The question becomes whether taking someone's belongings and using them as bait to make the person move constitutes movement by force, threat, or fraud under the kidnapping statute. Most courts would likely find this movement too minimal for kidnapping, but it illustrates how these crimes exist on a spectrum. This hypothetical shows us how context matters enormously in crimes against the person. The same physical acts, touching, standing close, or restricting movement, might be criminal or innocent depending on the broader situation. the relationship between the parties, and the scope of consent. It also demonstrates how modern courts must adapt traditional definitions of force and confinement to address more subtle forms of coercion. So with that, let's wrap up our discussion of crimes against the person. We've covered a lot of ground in these 2 episodes, looking at how assault, battery, false imprisonment, and kidnapping function both individually and in combination. Remember, these crimes often occur along a spectrum of escalating conduct. What starts as an assault might become a battery, and what begins as false imprisonment might develop into kidnapping if the defendant moves the victim. The key is to analyze each crime's elements separately, even when they arise from the same criminal episode. For assault, we're looking at the creation of fear, that reasonable apprehension of immediate harmful contact. With battery, we need actual contact. But remember, it doesn't have to be direct. Throwing an object that hits someone counts just as much as punching them directly. False imprisonment requires us to think carefully about what constitutes confinement. As we saw in our hypotheticals, it's not just about locked doors and physical restraints. Courts recognize that confinement can occur through psychological coercion, threats, or even the withholding of property necessary for escape. And finally, kidnapping adds that crucial element of movement or asportation to the mix. The movement must be substantial, but what counts as substantial often depends on the circumstances and jurisdiction. These crimes against the person are particularly important to understand because they protect fundamental human rights, the right to be free from fear of harm, the right to bodily integrity, and the right to move freely. They're also some of the most commonly tested topics on the bar exam or law school exams because they allow test writers and exam writers to explore subtle distinctions and complex fact patterns. When you're analyzing these issues, whether on an exam or in practice, remember to break down each crime into its required elements. Consider how consent or lack thereof affects the analysis. Think about how the relationship between the parties might matter. Look for less obvious forms of force or confinement, and consider whether one crime might have escalated into another. Understanding these nuances will help you spot issues more effectively and develop stronger legal arguments about crimes against the person. Hopefully, the examples we talked about today provided helpful illustrations of how to work through the nuances distinguishing different crimes against the person. Thank you so much for watching. Please make sure to give us a like, subscribe, and leave a comment if you have any questions. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, please check out lawschooltoolbox.com.